because that is the reality of where we are now. So unless Russia pulls back its troops and Russia guarantees the sovereignty of Ukraine and stabilizes that region for a second, we are only going to get into more escalation, and we're only getting closer to war here. So the first step has to be taken by Russia. Russia cannot say, sorry, NATO is not allowed to have troops here, so we will carry on doing what we want to do. No, because those countries which are NATO countries in those areas are going to be worried about what Russia is doing and is going to say NATO has to guarantee our security because it's their right to do that. And so they will say, please, NATO, can you put some troops in? That's exactly what's happened. So the first step has to be taken by Russia. It cannot keep its troops in the tens of thousands in eastern Ukraine while claiming that they pose no threat, while claiming that there is no threat to anyone else. There are tens of thousands of troops. There are pictures taken of these people. There are convoys of people coming in.
Sonny,
all these evidences
the numbers
sure, fine. We can debate the numbers. That's fine. We can debate the numbers. I don't have a problem with that. And Dmitry himself can accuse anyone of lies, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. But the fact of the matter is that NATO is not going to withdraw its troops from that region while the sovereignty of other NATO members in that region feels threatened. And they do feel threatened by Russian aggression because they've been invaded by Russia in the past. So they will say that. And the first step to de-escalation has to be taken by Russia.
Dmitry, do you believe that Russia may be harboring any ill intentions towards member states of NATO because of Article 5, if anything else?
No, I don't think so. But before answering, can I just ask a couple of quick questions to Ian Kearns? Well, Ian, you just said that NATO was not involved in the invasion of Iraq. Do you agree that NATO was involved in the regime change in Libya?
Yes, of course, NATO was involved in military action in Libya.
Okay, fine. That's what I wanted to hear. Now, do you agree? I will be very quick.
Your point being what, Dima? Well, I'm asking you what the point you think you've established.
I said quick question, quick answer. The second question is, do you agree with Senator McCain, who just said in an interview to CBS that Libya is a failed state paralyzed by a civil war now?
I think that Libya is a complete basket case, and I don't think Western intervention there produced anything like the result that people in the West thought it would produce. However, for what it's worth, I think for what it's worth, I think Western intervention did stop a pretty awful slaughter in Benghazi. And one of the things that people who, in the world who go around, blaming everything on the West always amaze me by is they must think that this is a Garden of Eden if only the West would stop screwing it up. I mean, seriously, there have been occasions when Western power has been used. It doesn't always produce the effects that people like. Often, the reason for its use is not some kind of geopolitical motivation, but an attempt to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. I think that was the motivation in Libya. I think the ultimate outcome has been bad.
Yes, very, very good motivation, yes. So, unfortunately,
what was the Russian motivation in Chechnya when Russian troops used all of the same tanks, air power and artillery that you're saying the Ukrainians are using in Ukraine?
It's just amazing how liberal people are very intolerant, not only of other people's views, but also even of other people's questions.
I don't think I can be accused of intolerance of you, Dima.
My question was so short, just 10 seconds, and your answer was so long. That just brings me to the question that Nikolai has just asked. No, I don't think that Russia harbors any aggressive intent towards any NATO members. The case in Ukraine and in eastern Ukraine in particular is very, very special. And to compare it with the American invasion of Iraq is, I think is just absurd, because I think anyone with distant knowledge of geography knows that there is more similarity between Russians and people who live in the east of Ukraine than between Americans and the British and the people who live in Iraq.
Dima, can I ask you a short question? Just a short question.
It's impossible to speak.
No, but just a very short question. Just a very short question.
Okay, ask me your short question.
Does that justify what Russia did? The fact that it's nearer to the Russian border and that some Russians live there? Is that the justification for a Russian invasion?
I was on the border. No, I think everything that Russia is doing in Ukraine is justified because I was at the border just recently. I saw the refugees who were cursing Mr. Poroshenko, who were cursing the new regime in Kiev, until the new regime came thanks to the so-called revolution imposed on Ukraine by the West. Ukraine had internal divisions, but it lived peacefully. It was only after this revolution, which, like many revolutions, was a bloody one, that Ukraine was plunged into a civil war. And I think this is very important here, that there is this difference of perceptions.
It was a short question, Dima. Thanks for the long answer.
Okay. Russia thinks that what's going on in Ukraine is a civil war. The Western media keeps saying that this is a Russian invasion. And this is simply not true, because if indeed Russia had tens of thousands of troops in eastern Ukraine, as Sunny is saying, then there would be not 10 people taken prisoner by the Ukrainian forces, but there would be hundreds of prisoners and hundreds of defectors. The war in Georgia, which was much shorter and much less cruel, there were about 10 Russian defectors who spoke to television in Tbilisi. This was not the case in Ukraine, and this makes all of these claims about Russian involvement very, very, very doubtful. Talking about what Sunny just said, that NATO should station its troops in Ukraine and should have stationed them in eastern Ukraine, I think it's a very good justification for what Putin did in Crimea, because the main motivation behind Russia's decision to take Crimea was that if Russia hadn't done it, there would have been NATO bases there in a year, maybe in 2 years. With the new regime in Kiev, this is more than possible. I agree with Ian that we live through a very, very dangerous period in the history of mankind, because the ability to listen to each other has never been smaller. The amount of unchecked information and direct lies in the media has never been greater. And I think we should all stop and think before we make another step. I think that basic reality on the ground is that Russia is not an aggressive state. Russia has not tried to invade NATO countries when it had a possibility to do it since the end of the Second World War. Russia peacefully gave up its influence in Central and Eastern Europe, and instead of gratitude, it got more and more strangling from the West. It got unfriendly actions in Georgia, in Ukraine, the creation of a whole belt of hostile countries around Russia. The Russian elite is still very intent on cooperation with the West. The West would commit a terrible mistake if it continues to alienate the Russian elite by imposing sanctions. And these sanctions are not going to end the civil war in Ukraine, because it's a civil war in Ukraine, not in Russia. You can impose tens of sanctions on Russia. This will not end the war in another country.
What next for NATO and Russia and Ukraine? Chris Neal.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're moving on to useful territory here, because I think the important thing is not to spend a lot of time talking about the causes and getting involved in a blame game here, because the situation is so frightening. I mean, in both of the theatres that we've been discussing, it seems to me that both sides, and we're here in the West, we have to concentrate very, very hard on everything we can do that will de-escalate tension, that will allow the possibility of political solutions and political discussions that can avoid not just the wars as they are, but avoid them spreading out of control into the regions. And it seems to me that increasing sanctions against Russia at this particular point is a bad thing to do, because it can only escalate. I think more war games in Ukraine or on the borders of Ukraine, again, for the same reasons, are a bad thing. And I think the idea of stepping up bombing on ISIS is basically precisely what they want, and so also a bad idea. I think we need to be moving much more in the direction of political solutions and actually getting the arms out of these regions. I mean, one thing that would be useful would be to tell the Saudis and the Qataris not to be funding the kind of groups that ISIS and similar types of groups. We want to get the weapons out of the situation, demilitarize it, and do everything we can to reduce tension.
Can I just have a quick question for Chris? Chris, do you think that Russia invaded Russia invaded Ukraine?
Ukraine?
Yeah.
You mean Crimea?
And as well as Eastern Ukraine.
Well, I mean, you gave the figure of 10,000 troops.
No. That wasn't my question.
But I'm saying you gave the figure of 10,000 troops, and I haven't seen that figure in anywhere else.
That wasn't my question.
No, I know, but I'm coming to answer your question. I think there are Russian soldiers, and I think there is Russian hardware in eastern Ukraine. I think exactly how official that is, whether that's being driven by the government, I'm not absolutely sure. And honestly,
so Russia did not annex Crimea?
No, I'm getting onto that point. If you'll
let me. It was a quick question.
Yeah, but you talked about eastern Ukraine, not Crimea.
So Russia has.
So can I finish? So what I'm saying is, I think there are Russian troops. I think there are Russian tanks in eastern Ukraine at the moment. It may well be on a kind of slightly unofficial basis. Definitely it's nowhere near 10,000 troops. I mean, we know that. And the crisis in eastern Ukraine happened before, undoubtedly kicked off, before there was any Russian militarization of the situation. They did clearly take...
So do you condemn Russian militarization of the situation?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a good thing. No, I don't. But
do you condemn what Russia? Do you condemn Russia's annexation of Crimea?
I think I think it was unhelpful. But I think it's a situation that has been detonated primarily and created and generated in the first place by what I talk about, which you haven't mentioned, which is the incredible expansion of Western military power into the region, which was almost inevitably going to create a reaction. And I actually think it's incredible. It's surprising that it hasn't created more of a reaction now. And if you could stop interrupting me. So, yeah, I'm against escalation. That's what I just said. But we're in the West. And what we need to do, because we're in the West, we need to talk about what the West should and shouldn't do primarily. And for me,
why not? I mean,
because
why not condemn what Russia is doing?
I just did.
We're running out of time.
Okay,
We've discussed this at length, I think.
In terms of where we're going to go next, I would just like to say there are some important conversations taking place in Minsk today. I think the peace plan that President Putin outlined can be the basis of some move forward with a couple of additions. I think all Russian, not just Ukrainian heavy artillery and so on, has to be moved out of eastern Ukraine, but all of the Russian military and all of its hardware, the armoured columns and all the rest, all needs to be gone. That needs to be internationally monitored, all of it, the Ukrainian and Russian side, and the border has to be put under international control, I think, by OSCE observers and others to make sure that that is secure. And then I think you might have the basis for at least a space, a pause in which people inside Ukraine can have a political conversation about what kind of long-term settlement there might be. And I think on the point of exercises, finally, I don't think all of these exercises are welcome or useful. I think personally myself that applies to some of the exercises that involve NATO countries, although they're in a very small scale involving about 1,500 troops in the far west of Ukraine. And of course, I will just end on this point, and I know some won't like it, but they don't compare in anything like the scale of the genuinely quite massive tens of thousands of troops scale of Russian military exercises which have been taking place close to Ukraine and elsewhere. And a number of different exercises. And everybody knows
they're on Russian
territory. Everybody knows that they're there to politically intimidate people in Eastern Europe.
Russia.
It's not rocket science.
So you're okay with Russian aggression on the border, but you're not okay. You're against.
Gentlemen, please. We're going round the table. Sunny, I heard you saying that next NATO should be putting troops in Ukraine. Wouldn't it be pouring oil on fire?
But
I agree. I mean, I don't think that NATO. I think NATO troops in Ukraine would escalate the situation.
Well, that's what's happening.
Yeah, right. But the Ukrainian sovereignty cannot be guaranteed unless Russian troops come back from the border and Russian troops come out of Eastern Europe. So Russia, unless it takes the first steps, does not de-escalate the situation. And unless Russia does that, we are not going to reach anywhere near a peace deal. So NATO has two choices. Either it completely says, it abandons Ukraine and says, you know what, we can't guarantee you.
Ukraine's not in NATO.
So can you just let me finish the point? Either NATO says to Ukraine that, sorry, we kind of led you up the garden path and said to you earlier that we will support you, but now we're not going to do that. And in which case, other countries in Eastern Europe, which are part of NATO, will sort of doubt whether NATO is a viable alliance, and they will start worrying about their own security. Or NATO says to Ukraine, we will help you because our own members are also being threatened here. So NATO has to do the latter, in my view, and the latter means that it has to tell Russia quite in strong terms that you either de-escalate and you leave, or we will put troops in the region. So I think that unless Russia makes the first steps to de-escalate, then Russia has no business telling other people that they're escalating, because its troops are the reason why there is so much tension.
Okay, Sonia, we heard you. Dmitry, what is the best way of guaranteeing Ukraine's security and de-escalating this crisis and actually going into the peaceful solutions?
I liked the constructive tone of Ian Kearns, and I would like to continue in that vein. I think urgent talks need to take place between Russia and NATO. Maybe we should re-establish the framework of Russia-NATO Council talks on preserving the arms and security agreements which we had and which are all seem to be threatened right now. We should decide what we do with NATO-Russia Founding Act signed in 1997. Probably both sides should take certain obligations upon themselves. I would remind you that the idea of that pact, of that Founding Act, was very good. You know, NATO proclaimed that it had no intention to station its troops permanently very close to Russian borders, and Russia took certain obligations upon itself, which could be useful right now. Also, I think that talks in Minsk need to be held, but Kiev should be represented by someone someone else than former President Leonid Kuchma, who is extremely unpopular both in the West and in the East of Ukraine. Kiev should be represented by someone serious. Of course, representatives of Eastern Ukraine should also be invited. In general, we should draw lessons from the past crisis. I would remind you that former President Yanukovych suggested a trilateral meeting between Russia, EU, and Ukraine on ironing out their differences